Imagine a sphere of glass and aluminum, no larger than a womb, suspended in the freezing slipstream, 30,000 feet above the Earth. It is hanging from the belly of a B-17 bomber, a machine the Americans call the Flying Fortress. But for the man inside this glass ball, there is nothing fortress-like about his existence. He is curled into a fetal position with his knees pressed tight against his ears and his hands gripping the control handles of two 50 caliber machine guns. The temperature outside is 60 degrees below zero. It is so cold that if his electric heating suit fails for even 30 seconds, his sweat will freeze instantly and he will lose consciousness. He is isolated. He is terrified. And he is the only thing standing between the belly of the bomber and the swarm of German fighter planes rising from the clouds below to kill him. This is the ball turret gunner. It was widely considered the most dangerous job in World War II. While the pilot sat in an armored cockpit and the waist gunners could move around inside the fuselage, the ball turret gunner was literally outside the plane. He was suspended in a fragile bubble of plexiglass in aluminum, spinning 360 degrees, tracking targets that moved at 400 miles an hour. He had no parachute because there was no room for one inside the ball. If the plane was hit, he had to climb out into the fuselage to put it on. If the turret jammed, he was trapped. And if the landing gear failed, he would be the first thing to touch the ground. To understand the horror, you first have to understand the machine. The Sperry Ball Turret was essentially a sphere made of aluminum and plexiglass, roughly 4 feet in diameter. Think about that dimension for a moment. 4 feet. A standard doorway is nearly 7 feet tall. This entire weapon system was smaller than a dining room table. Into this tiny space, engineers crammed 2 heavy Browning M2 machine guns, 2 ammunition cans holding 500 rounds each, a hydraulic motor, an oxygen system, a radio, a gun sight, and finally, a human being. It was a marvel of engineering, but a nightmare of ergonomics. There was no seat in the traditional sense. The gunner sat on a small metal plate, his back resting against the rear armor, his legs held up in stirrups on either side of the center window. He was positioned like an unborn child. The guns were mounted on either side of his head, mere inches from his ears. When he fired, the noise was not just a sound, it was a physical assault. The concussion would rattle his teeth and vibrate through his skull. The smell of cordite and burnt oil would fill the tiny sphere, choking the air even as the oxygen mask pumped life into his lungs. The vibration was so intense it could blur his vision, making it hard to track the tracers flying toward him. The turret was powered by an electro-hydraulic system. It could rotate a full 360 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically. This meant that the gunner could spin until he was flying backwards or tilt until he was looking straight down at the ground 5 miles below. The control was a double-handled grip that looked like a video game controller from the future. It was extremely sensitive. A slight twist of the wrist would send the turret spinning. This agility was crucial because the German fighters, the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, were fast. They could close the distance from 2,000 yards to point-blank range in seconds. But the most critical piece of engineering wasn't the guns or the motor. It was the suit. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin and lethal. Without oxygen, a man will pass out in 60 seconds and die in minutes. The temperature is consistently 60 to 70 degrees below zero. Frostbite is instant. If a gunner touched the bare metal of his guns with an ungloved hand, his skin would fuse to the steel, and tearing it away would strip the flesh to the bone. To survive this, the gunner wore the F2 heated suit. It was a blue wool uniform lined with electrical wires like a heated blanket, shaped like a jumpsuit. They called it the Blue Bunny. He plugged it into the aircraft's electrical system via a cord inside the turret. This cord was his umbilical line. It provided heat and it provided the connection for his microphone. But the system was fragile. In the violent thrashing of combat, wires could snap. Connectors could come loose. If the heat failed, the gunner wouldn't just be cold, he would freeze to death in his position, his body turning into a solid block of ice before the plane even landed. Entering the turret was a process that felt like being buried alive. The turret hung low, so ground clearance was minimal. The gunner couldn't enter from the outside while the plane was on the ground. He had to wait until the B-17 was in the air. Once they reached 10,000 feet, he would leave the relative safety of the fuselage, open a small hatch in the floor, and lower himself into the ball. He would curl his body into the required shape, strap himself in, and close the heavy steel door above him. At that moment, he was sealed in. He was no longer part of the crew, he was a component of the weapon.
The optical gun sight, the K4, hung directly in front of his face. It projected a reticle, a circle of orange light, onto a glass plate. The gunner had to look through this glass, calculate the speed of the enemy plane, adjust for the lead, aiming ahead of the target, and fire. It required intense concentration. But doing this while spinning upside down, breathing pure oxygen through a rubber mask that smelled of rubber and sweat, while flak exploded around him, required more than skill. It required the ability to suppress the screaming instinct of self-preservation. By 1943, the air war over Europe had turned into a meat grinder. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that was statistically unsustainable. A tour of duty was 25 missions. The mathematical probability of surviving 25 missions was less than 30%. For the ball turret gunner, the odds felt even worse. He was the most exposed man on the plane. When German pilots attacked, they often aimed for the engines or the cockpit, but their cannon shells didn't discriminate. Flak was the primary killer. Flak is the abbreviation for Fliegerabwehrkanonen, the German anti-aircraft guns. These 88mm cannons fired shells that exploded at a preset altitude, filling the air with jagged chunks of razor-sharp steel. For the crew inside the fuselage, the armored walls offered some protection, but for the ball turret gunner suspended below the plane, there was almost no armor. He was sitting in plexiglass. When a flak shell burst below the plane, the shrapnel flew upwards. The ball turret was the first thing it hit. The gunners described the sound of flak as pebbles being thrown against a tin roof, but when a piece penetrated, it wasn't a pebble. It was a hot knife. A piece of shrapnel the size of a finger could tear through the aluminum seat, through the heated suit, and through the man inside. Because of the fetal position, a wound to the legs or stomach was almost guaranteed. And there was nowhere to go. You couldn't duck, you couldn't hide. You just had to sit there and pray the next burst wasn't closer. Then there were the fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots were professionals. They quickly realized that the ball turret had a limitation. It could turn fast, but not instantly. They developed a tactic called the head-on attack. They would fly straight at the nose of the bomber, firing their cannons, and then dive underneath. As they dove, they would rake the belly of the B-17 with machine gun fire. The ball turret gunner would see a Focke-Wulf 190 coming straight at his face, its wings lighting up with muzzle flashes. He had a split second to fire back before the plane screamed past him, inches away. The psychological strain was immense. Unlike the other crew members who could look at each other, give a thumbs up, or check on a wounded buddy, the ball turret gunner was alone. He was connected only by the intercom. He could hear the pilot screaming orders, the navigator calling out coordinates, the waist gunners shouting about bandits at 3 o'clock, but he couldn't see them. He was suspended in a void. Sometimes, if the intercom system was damaged by gunfire, he was cut off completely. He would be fighting a silent war, spinning in his glass ball, watching planes burn and fall around him, wondering if his own plane was on fire, wondering if the crew above him was dead or alive. One of the most harrowing aspects of the job was the ammunition management. The gunner had 1,000 rounds. That sounds like a lot, but the Browning Hem-2 fires at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. With 2 guns, that is 1,600 rounds per minute. If the gunner held the trigger down, he would run out of ammo in less than 40 seconds. He had to fire in short, disciplined bursts. He had to be a sniper with a machine gun. If he ran out, he was defenseless. He was just a spectator in a glass cage. The physical toll was just as bad as the mental one. The constant vibration of the plane, the roaring of the engines, and the lack of pressurization caused severe physical trauma. Gunners suffered from sinus pain that felt like needles being driven into their face. They suffered from the bends caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in the blood due to rapid ascent. Many men landed with blood leaking from their ears and noses, yet they cleaned themselves up, ate a meal, and got back into the turret the next morning. And then there was the ultimate nightmare, the emergency exit. The ball turret was equipped with a system to jettison the ball in case of a crash landing, or the gunner could climb back up into the fuselage. But both options required time and mechanical function. If the plane was spiraling out of control, the centrifugal force would pin the gunner against the glass. He wouldn't be able to lift his arms to open the hatch. He would be trapped. Many bombers crashed with the gunner still inside, screaming on the intercom until the ground silenced them.
But nothing, absolutely nothing, haunted the nightmares of B-17 crews more than the mechanical failure of the landing gear. The B-17 sits high off the ground on massive wheels. There is just enough clearance for the ball turret to hang underneath. But if the hydraulic systems were shot out or the wheels refused to lock down, the pilot had to perform a belly landing. He had to skid the 40,000-pound aircraft along the runway on its stomach. For the crew in the fuselage, a belly landing was terrifying, but survivable. They would brace themselves, sparks would fly, the plane would screech to a halt. But for the ball turret gunner, a belly landing was a death sentence. The ball turret hung lower than the fuselage. If the plane landed on its belly, the turret would be the first thing to hit the concrete. It would be ground down like a piece of chalk on a sidewalk. The protocol was clear. If the landing gear fails, the gunner must get out of the turret immediately. He must climb up into the fuselage. But combat is chaotic. Mechanisms get damaged. The door gears could jam, the flak damage could warp the metal rings sealing the turret shut. There is a story that every 8th Air Force veteran knows. It is a story that is whispered in barracks and written in memoirs. It happened to a B-17 returning from a raid over Germany. The plane had been mauled. The hydraulic system was dead. The landing gear would not come down. The pilot radioed the tower that he had to make a belly landing. He ordered the crew to brace. He ordered the ball turret gunner to come up. But the gunner replied, his voice trembling on the intercom, that he couldn't. The flak had bent the rotation gear. The turret was stuck in a position where the door was blocked. He couldn't open it. He was trapped. The crew tried to pry it open from the inside. They used crowbars. They pulled until their hands bled, but the metal was fused. The pilot circled the airfield burning off fuel, buying time, but there was no solution. They couldn't repair the gear in the air. They couldn't jettison the turret because the release mechanism was jammed too. The pilot had a choice: bail out the entire crew and let the plane crash. But they were over England, overpopulated areas, and the pilot and co-pilot would have to stay to steer it away from houses. Or land the plane. The gunner knew what was coming. He knew the physics. He knew that in a few minutes he would be the cushion between 30 tons of aluminum and the hard earth. The conversation over the intercom in those final minutes is something that history has tried to forget, but cannot. The gunner didn't scream. He didn't beg. He asked for a cigarette. But he couldn't have one because of the oxygen mask. He spoke to his friends. He told the pilot it wasn't his fault. As the plane touched down, the sound was hideous. Metal tearing against asphalt, sparks showering like fireworks. The ball turret disintegrated instantly. The plane slid for 1,000 feet before coming to a rest. When the rescue crews arrived, they didn't need to check the turret. There was nothing left to check. The gunner was gone, erased by the friction of the landing. This tragedy was immortalized in a poem by Randall Jarrell, simply titled "The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner." It is only 5 lines long, but it captures the brutality of the experience better than any history book. The last line reads, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose." It is a gruesome image. It is violent, but it is the truth. The men who volunteered for this duty were often the smallest men in the crew. You had to be small to fit. Many were barely 5 foot 4 inches tall. They were often the youngest, the kids of the crew.
They were chosen for their size, but they were defined by a courage that is hard to comprehend today. They knew the statistics. They knew that if the plane went down, they were likely the ones who wouldn't make it out. Yet mission after mission, they climbed into the sphere, they curled their bodies into that unnatural position, they plugged in their heated suits, and they waited for the Luftwaffe. There is the story of Sergeant McGee, a ball turret gunner who fell 20,000 feet without a parachute and survived. His B-17 was hit by flak and spun out of control. The centrifugal force ripped the turret right off the plane with McGee still inside it. He fell 4 miles. But the glass of the turret shattered high in the air, and he was thrown free. He landed through the glass roof of a train station in France and landed on the steel beams, which flexed and absorbed the impact. He was captured by the Germans and treated for his injuries. He was the only known man to survive a free fall from that altitude in a turret. But for every miracle like McGee, there were thousands who vanished. Andy Rooney, the famous journalist who was a reporter for Stars and Stripes during the war, wrote about the ball turret gunners. He didn't call them heroes in the traditional sense. He called them the most isolated men in the war. He wrote about how when a plane came back with the turret shot up, the ground crews would just stare at it in silence. There was a reverence for the men who rode in the ball. It was a job that required a suppression of fear that bordered on madness. It required a man to accept that he had already died and simply waiting for the confirmation. The B-17 Flying Fortress is remembered as the plane that saved Europe. It is an icon of American industrial might. We see them in air shows today, gleaming in the sun, polished aluminum reflecting the sky. We admire their lines. We listen to the roar of their radial engines. But if you ever get close to one, walk to the back. Look underneath. Look at that small, round glass bubble hanging precariously from the belly. Put your hand against the glass. Imagine being 19 years old. Imagine the temperature is 60 below zero. Imagine the world spinning around you. And imagine seeing a stream of tracer bullets racing toward your face. And imagine knowing that the only thing protecting you is a 1/4 inch of plexiglass and your own refusal to give up. Imagine the silence of the radio when the plane takes a hit. Imagine the feeling of the landing gear refusing to lower. The ball turret was a marvel of engineering. It solved the problem of the blind spot. It helped win the air war, but the price was paid by the men inside it. They were the eyes under the fortress. They were the guardians of the belly, and too often, they were the sacrifice that brought the rest of the crew home. They were the men who lived and died in a glass coffin at 30,000 feet.